And the television is representing this whole other discourse, entertainment discourse, which is the capitalist for-profit structuring of information. And when the child is identifying with those figures, again, it's entering into language, meaning it's a mourning process, it's internalizing these authority figures that become part of the superego, and is learning to negotiate in that language, which is different from the language of the home. It's a language of myth, it's a language of legend, language of narrative, and so on through. All right, history, same way. You learn to identify with your community. Why are Americans, why do they grow up American and not Chinese? Well, not just in terms of the language, but also in terms of the sports and the heroes and the beliefs and the values and behaviors. They've internalized the whole thing, not just the language. Where you learn that in school, you learn that in scouts and sports and all these other institutional activities. You're entering into a language. Well, the point we want to make in terms of the consultancy and the functioning of the maestri in the consultancy is that when someone solves a problem, they don't just solve the problem in terms of the discipline formation that they learn, whether that's physics or any anthropology or chemistry or whatever the discipline is. They also solve it in terms of the way they've learned to address problems in the other discourses. So what the maestri tries to identify is, all right, what is the organizing problem of your childhood existence, and how was that problem solved? What is the organizing problem of the entertainment discourse that you most admire and enjoy, and how are problems solved there? Similarly with your community had problems. How do we know what its problems were? Well, historically it remembered certain kinds of issues, certain kinds of problems that were then solved in some way or another. So you can just look around and find out how your community thinks. Like the community I grew up in, it was called Custer County. I went to Custer County High School. What was the defining problem for my home community? Well, it was the Indian Wars. How was the problem solved? Well, Custer Massacre is ironic that it's so symbolic for how the problem was solved, because the way the problem was solved was it wasn't the soldiers that got massacred. Well, in that one instance it was, but mostly it was the Native Americans that got massacred. I mean, the worst thing that ever happened to Native Americans was the Custer Battle, because it so galvanized the world about the Indian problem, so-called. I mean, Custer being defeated by Native Americans was unthinkable. He was a star already in his day. He was the most famous. He was the youngest general in the Civil War. Extremely famous, considered to be, this master Indian fighter, totally undeserved reputation, but nonetheless, this was his media. In the society of spectacle, it was already forming. He was already a star of this sort. And for him to get beat, it would have been like if Schwarzkopf would have been massacred when he, went to Iraq or something. Just completely unthinkable. So it caused this huge, massive, we've got to do something about this problem. Well, the way the problem was solved was by violence. This is how the community solved this problem. This is how our entertainment discourses solve the problems. You got a problem, you kill somebody, you fight, those are our heroes normally. And similarly, so this was the idea, was to line up allegorically the problems. The problem in your discipline, for example, in our discipline, the problem of the society of the spectacle, how is that problem going to be solved? Well, you're going to line up. The person that's going to solve that problem is going to be someone whose other problem-solving experience in the other parts of the discourse are going to be brought to bear in an innovative way on that discipline problem. So this was what the maestri does, is it as a pedagogy and as a learning experience, it coordinates this the disciplinary materials with the other languages that the person knows. This is quite different from literate education. In literate education, basically, when you come to school, you block off the other thing. Your entertainment experience is not considered relevant. They don't want a bunch of people rapping or breakdancing, in physics class. Or problems of the home. I mean, you got to deal with those, but basically, look, I don't care if you're living in a, underneath a truck, you've been kicked out of your home. You got to come and you got to attend class, and all this. So all these other situations were excluded, because this is the way literacy works. It analyzes, it divides, it splits things up, separates things out, work over here, play over there, home in another place, everything's separate. Electracy is quite different. In electracy, everything comes together. Electracy is holistic. So so I was researching, all right, how does this go together, this sort of ecological, global interconnectedness of everything that we now understand in electricity. I was looking at the map of the Custer battlefield, and you know, how did Custer solve his problem? He's got all these Indians. The big problem he was working with was he didn't want the Indians to run away. This seems very funny to us now. You know, here's Custer with his 600 men or whatever, and he's facing, I don't know, maybe 10,000 Indians. I mean, 5,000 warriors, but he didn't know that. So he's thinking, all right, what normally happens is the Native American battle style wasn't to line up and, you know, march. It was, you know, hit and run. It was, you know, what we think of as guerrilla tactics. And so a lot of times when they saw a superior force, they would split. They would leave the scene. And so Custer divides up his troops, and he says, all right, you know, Benteen, you go around back. You know, I'll circle around back the other side, and then Reno, you go in the front and spook them out. You know, and then we'll catch him and kill him, whatever. That was his plan. So, of course, as we know, it didn't work out. And so Custer's all by himself with, you know, like a third of his men. He had split up his troops. Like, he had 5 companies, Reno had 5 companies, Benteen had 3 companies. And this is the way the military still works. You got your troop, your army, it was 7th Cavalry. They're divided into companies, and the companies are identified by letters. You know, Company C, Company A. And so I was looking at the battlefield map drawn by, you know, the historians, and they showed the arrows, and here's Benteen and stuff, and you know, here's Reno. He went in, he got confronted. Whoops, you know, this is a little more intense. He retreats up to these cliffs. And then Custer, meanwhile, circling around, trying to find a way to cross Little Bighorn River. And he's got 5 companies with him. And on the battlefield map, you could see, all right, the Indians attack. You know, Custer's overwhelmed. His captains form the 5 companies into kind of a semicircle, ring of defense on this hillside. And that's where they're going to make the last stand. I said, well, I look at these, and they've marked the positions on the battlefield map with these letters, you know, of the companies. Here's company, you know, whatever. And I said, well, and they had the letters of the companies. And I said, wouldn't it be great? You know, according to my method, that should spell something. You know, that wouldn't it be great if that spelled Ulmer? You know, U-L, companies U, company L. That would be a sign, right? I mean, if the battlefield map said Ulmer, it would indicate that, you know, hey, you know, this has something to do with you, you know, pay attention. Well, of course, it didn't spell Ulmer. So I looked, and what were the letters? Well, in the arrangement that they were in, C-E-F-I-L didn't spell anything, at least not in English. So then I said, well, maybe, you know, because the method is linguistic, looking for the signifier that repeats, maybe it's an anagram. So I anagrammed it, and it anagrammed into ficelle. Now, ficelle is a French term. It so happens in French, with its gender thing, that it was feminine rather than masculine. So as feminine, it had an extra L and E, but you don't need those. So as F-I-C-E-L. In French, it would go on L-E, would be ficelle. Wow, ficelle. I was stunned. You know, I staggered around. I said, there on the hillside in this map was the word ficelle. Now, ficelle is an extremely important term, both in the history of English literature and in French post-structuralism. Just to fill you in, originally Henry James had already used this term. Henry James wrote these wonderful prefaces to his novels, theorizing literature, some of the most important literary theory ever written by a practicing writer. And he was explaining how his novels worked. And he said, you always need a character who's a helping character. You know, you get the protagonist, and then the protagonist, especially like in Henry James's very convoluted, internalized, reflective stories, that all the action is internal pretty much. So in order for this to be told as a drama, the protagonist has to tell this to somebody. There has to be somebody you can tell a story to. And the only purpose for this figure who's going to be the interlocutor is formal. You know, like you need it for that purpose. Well, James called such characters ficelle.